Okay, thanks very much, and I hope you all can hear me. I think I have a strong enough voice I can dispense with the microphone. Neasa MacErlean begins her biography of Dudley Edwards, her grandfather, with these words. Out of World War II came a new kind of history, one that was intended to protect against manipulation by dictators and other propagandists. The generation of young historians behind this intellectual revolution believed that a scientific approach could make the world safer. Dudley Edwards was one of the historians behind this intellectual revolution. Those of us who were privileged to know him and to have been taught by him were imbued with that belief in the importance of the study of history, and I strive in my own work to be faithful to it. This is a wonderful biography of a great man, and we are honoured to have with us today his granddaughter, who will speak to us about Dudley's work, particularly in relation to O'Connell and Parnell. I don't know if Dudley ever addressed the Parnell Summer School here in Avondale, but it is a great pleasure for me to welcome his granddaughter here. You have the floor, Neasa.
I'm not sure actually myself if he came here, but he was obviously a great admirer of Charles Stewart Parnell and spent, actually I've got the number later on in my speech, 23 years I think researching and writing about Parnell. So that's a long time in a professor's life. He was a professor for 35 years. Actually, I'd better just explain one controversy that's already broken out between your first and second speakers, which is the difficult issue of pronunciation. We were trying to sort this out earlier over coffee, and Parnell is more the Meath pronunciation, we think. With Dudley always said Parnell, and obviously I couldn't, apart from when I just pronounced it, just said I couldn't say anything other than Parnell, which we think is possibly the Wicklow pronunciation, but there'd probably be someone.
Well, I grew up about 10 kilometres from here, and we always call it Parnell.
Parnell. Right. Okay. There.
That was Parnell Park, but I mean not Parnell.
Parnell, yeah. Because Dudley did spend a lot of time researching pronunciation. Of course, Catherine O'Shea.
That was not actually in that drum, so I don't know what those strangers did. But I think they did the same.
Okay, great. So I wonder if we could just go back to 1958, and it's an April evening, the 19th of April, and there are two men talking to each other about Daniel O'Connell in Dublin. And one of them is Robert Dudley Edwards, on the front of this book here. And the other person is Dan Bryan. And Dan Bryan, as many of you will know, was an absolute natural in the world of intelligence, and he was the head of G2 in Ireland's military intelligence during the Second World War. And these people, whose strength has grown even stronger to this day in the CIA, Mossad, MI6, all these organisations have just become stronger over these years. They're often very, very interested in history because they're interested in the spread of ideas and how quickly ideas can spread. And Parnell was one of the people who illustrated that, as was Daniel O'Connell, and as we're seeing now, in the change in politics around the world, the move back from democracy to strongman politics. These are ideas that are just taking hold within the last couple of years. In fact, most of this, what I'm going to tell you today, I'd written actually probably a week or two ago, but I had to update it last night, and I haven't checked the news today, so I'm probably out of date. So Dudley and Dan Bryan talking about O'Connell, and Dudley noted afterwards in his journal that evening, what Dan Bryan had said, and Dan Bryan said, Dan Bryan suggested tonight that O'Connell needs attention. He argued that he was, for Europe, the first real democrat. He thought his party political methods need studying as an inspiration for so much of later National Party movements. And Dan Bryan and Dudley, as he was known to many people and also to me, they had worked together in establishing in 1949 the new Military History Society in Ireland, and around the world, particularly in Europe, these societies of historians were being developed because, for obvious reasons, after the war, we realised that war was a subject we wanted to study so that we could prevent it, and there were many military people who were very interested in becoming the first historians in these groups. I spoke to someone who knew both Dudley and Dan Bryan and asked her if she could give me a bit of an insight into how their conversation might have gone. And this is Deirdre McMahon, whom some of you may know, the 20th century historian. And she said to me, remember the trajectory, it's a difficult word, trajectory, of Dan Bryan's astonishing career, his long role in intelligence, starting on Bloody Sunday in 1920, then the Civil War, then the Blue Shirts in the 1930s, and then the Nazis. Dan Bryan saw the great movements of these years, but he especially saw their dangers, particularly the involvement of the IRA with the Nazis during the war years, which he regarded as particularly dangerous. And then, so that's the spread of ideas and why intelligent people are so interested in that. And sometimes they can prevent some of these ideas from spreading in the wrong way. And you'll see whole departments of the CIA devoted to that, for instance. Anyway, Deirdre, looking at the relationship between Dudley and Dan Bryan, also said Dan Bryan was a voluminous reader of books, articles and documents which Robert Dudley Edwards admired. They knew each other well. They'd also worked together on setting up a chair of war studies for UCD, but that didn't happen until many years later, when neither of them was around, but it did happen. In fact, Dudley had already been very heavily engaged in researching Daniel O'Connell by the time that they'd had that conversation. And in fact, in 1947, when the Save Derrynane campaign was launched regarding the O'Connell family home, Dudley was there, one of the main speakers at that, and it was unfashionable for him to say this because Daniel O'Connell wasn't really regarded as a great Irish character in those days. He'd really fallen from grace, and Dudley became, as I explained in the book, there's a chapter called Restoring the Reputation of Daniel O'Connell. Dudley became one of the people who really worked hardest for decades to get people to look at Daniel O'Connell again. Anyway, on that day in Derrynane, he said, O'Connell is one of the most outstanding men, not merely in the history of Ireland, but in the history of democracy, and particularly in the history of Catholic democracy. One of the interesting things actually about writing about Dudley is, as I discovered, he just doesn't date. He calls so many of these shots right, and that's partly because he was so fascinated by politics. He was writing about the past, but most historians actually are very interested in the present. If they're not reading various newspapers and following all the politicians, it's a bit surprising because they nearly always have that present and future angle to their researchers. So I'm going to be speaking quite a bit about Parnell as well, but just but obviously one was the heir of the other in many ways. So I'll talk a bit more just at this stage about O'Connell. So why was it that Dudley was so interested in O'Connell? At that stage, he actually spent 10 years writing about O'Connell. I'd say the first thing is understanding. Dudley's view of history was that it should seek to help explain people to their old enemies. Dudley was actually anti-violence underneath it all, and he didn't want to be giving lectures like this to 20-year-olds to think of them going out to sacrifice themselves and other people's lives in the years to come. Actually, just a very quick detour on that. I was speaking to a friend of mine who knows a Ukrainian professor from Kyiv. She went back home after 3 years away. This is very sad. And she went to the cemetery and she counted 47 of her former students there. That was what Dudley didn't want to see. You were a student of his. He didn't want that to happen. So, talking about the purposes of history, Dudley said, one of the few small services to mankind that the study of history can offer is to break down prejudices which have survived from the past. And O'Connell was someone who was a great pioneer in understanding as his work through increasing democracy and who could vote reveals, if you can actually see that your constituency is greater. We were just talking about the small number of people in the constituency who could vote in Meath. Well, if you can see that number expanding, you're obviously trying to extend the people you're speaking to and the people who count. And that's what Dudley was so interested in. Also, O'Connell's ideas that all people are equal, men and women, black and white, slavery shouldn't exist. That was very much what Dudley believed. It's easy to say it now, but back then, not everyone believed that at all. I mean, the world had gone very close to becoming much more fascist and apartheid. The danger, that was another reason why Dudley was so interested in Daniel O'Connell and Dan Bryan too. Nationalism can be inspiring, but it can also be very negative. There's a book came out, a novel a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, by a Libyan writer called Hisham Matar, and it's called My Friends, and there's a historian character in the book, and the author writes of him saying he was obsessed with the political history of the Arab world, with a focus on the rise of nationalism, which he liked to describe as the colonizers' parting gift. And we have that here, of course. We had our two sides set against each other, and that this the dangers here of nationalism and ideas takes us back to why Dan Bryan was interested in the spread of ideas. Both just the third reason I give now as to why Dudley was so interested in O'Connell links him with Dan O'Brien again, because in the intelligence world in many ways could date itself back to when it really started going very proficiently, back to the Tudor times, and Dudley was a Tudor specialist at the start of his career. He covered everything but by the end, and so Dudley was writing about how from Henry VII onwards espionage was growing, and that trade in information, having your spies around the place so that they could tell you, report back to you what people really meant. I mean, here we are still trying to understand, what Charles Stewart Parnell really meant. Well, they were doing that just as much back then, obviously, particularly his enemies. And we've now moved into this world which Dudley and Dan O'Brien were looking forward to, where information is power to such a great degree, and mass communications create even more opportunities for that power to be wielded. Particularly now we're trying to understand how artificial intelligence will affect that, how artificial intelligence will affect elections too. So these are perennial issues which O'Connell and Parnell were such pioneers in understanding the expansion of the vote and how to make people political in their outlook who had never thought that they could understand these subjects or that they would benefit anything by understanding them. I'm in a slightly funny position here today, because probably in this room, the Parnell Society, there's one person I could point to here who knows probably less about Parnell and about Daniel O'Connell than anyone else, and that's me. because I've been looking at them for the last couple of years, but not a lifetime as many of you have. But I do have a couple of, I have a secret weapon, which is, Dudley had a book out on Daniel O'Connell in 1975, but he also wrote a half biography, 50,000 words, which is half a book, on Charles Stewart Parnell. And I think probably I'm the first person to have read it. It's in the UCD archives. I've read it and copied it, and just reread it. But yes, it was 23 years that Dudley was working on Charles Stewart Parnell. And so he was, even though his book is just half a book, he was obviously having to think about why was it that both O'Connell and Parnell, why their reputations suffered so much. Because Dudley was, when he was lecturing to his students, he was lecturing to people who knew something about 1916 because it had been drummed into them in school. But they maybe knew very little about Daniel O'Connell and Parnell too. And in 1966, at the 50-year commemoration of 1916, Dudley came out with a phrase about Patrick Pearse, which some of you might recognise, and that phrase was the triumph of failure. And just how was it that men who'd been so despised by their fellow Dubliners ended up becoming very, very quickly, not ended up, but were very quickly seen as the great emblems of Irish resistance, and still are to this day, hence the triumph of failure. But had Dudley wanted to, he could have turned that around. He could have written two books, one on O'Connell and one on Parnell, and called them The Failure of Triumph. Sadly, yeah. One of the things I've been doing, I've been persecuting people over the last week, even going in, asking people, well, who do you regard as your heroes? And it's not been that encouraging. And I think, sadly, the failure of triumph might be correct now, and let's hope that changes. Going in to get a prescription from the chemist and asking who was the 22-year-old guy's heroes. Well, he came out with Michael Collins, and didn't really know anything about Parnell and O'Connell. And some people confuse the two. You know, there's just about, well, Charles Stewart Parnell is well known for Catholic emancipation. You know, I mean, I give that person a couple of marks because at least he knows the name. I could have been even luckier than I am today. I've got the secret weapon, Dudley's half book, but he actually did give, just before Christmas 1954, a talk which I could usefully have cribbed, but I haven't managed to lay my hands on it yet. So, but what Dudley did do, he left a little summary. He said, O'Connell and Parnell compare and contrast. This is my lecture topic for tonight. Each is a phenomenon of democratic Europe, the first open-air Irishmen to acquire world renown through their power with the people. Each profoundly influenced the English reforming element by displaying their ability to intimidate anti-reform government. Dan did this in 28, Charlie in 79. So, yes, on first name terms sometimes. So to some degree, Daniel O'Connell has been recognised internationally, and is being now recognised internationally. You know, Barack Obama coming over here and talking about Daniel O'Connell and being given Patrick Gagan's one of Patrick Gagan's book on Daniel O'Connell. Charles Stewart Parnell maybe hasn't achieved that status as much. Really, certainly hasn't achieved it as much as he deserves. So just briefly on why did the reputations of the two fall? Well, we could spend days talking about that, obviously, but just a few quick ideas here. Not 1916, obviously, that came afterwards, and it was it's an idea of heroism that can be taught to anyone. History 100 years ago, you could have renamed it as patriotism, and also patriotism, preparation for you as a young boy, girls, didn't really matter, obviously. Preparation for you as a young boy to be prepared to give your life when you were called upon to give it, age 19 or whatever it might be. And so when Patrick Pearse was being taught in the schools, in some schools, they thought that he died age 33, the same age as Jesus Christ. And in fact, he was 36 when he died. But you can see the point that was being made. And it probably fairly simple in some ways to make this cry to the patriotic feelings of boys. If you were looking for role models, it's going to be far more complicated to say, look, I'll give you Daniel O'Connell and I'll give you Charles Stewart Parnell. No one even in the same room as them could work out what they were going to say next. They were such original thinkers. They were way beyond the understanding of other people. Let these be your models. Well, who would teach that in a senior school? Actually, that was how Dudley taught though. He was very unusual because he was saying, these iconoclastic people, let them be your models. Don't believe in what the church tells you. Don't believe in what the state tells you. Try to understand again. Don't just think that you need to make that simple sacrifice which ends your life. And then we get on to the idea of courage. I think both Daniel O'Connell and to a degree Charles Stewart Parnell were somehow accused of a lack of courage. Courage is a fascinating issue to examine. I sometimes hope that in the multidisciplinary academic world, which Dudley was so interested in, which was just taking off as his career was ending, that what we really need to do actually at some stage is history and neuroscience, because you get within the study of the brain, where is it that we make our views about, our moral views of people? Something like courage. If I decide, you can damn someone by saying, that man is a coward. You know yourselves, if ever you've heard a man being described like that, if you're a woman, it doesn't really make any difference. You're not expected to have anything like courage or fierceness. But the part of the brain that decides, makes that sort of moral issue, comes from back here, the limbic system. Sorry, this is me speaking here. I think Dudley would have been interested in these ideas, and in some ways I think he was probably, the neuroscience hadn't gone to this extent when he was around, but I think he would have been interested, because if I say that man over there is a coward, I'm appealing to this part of the brain, which is the limbics, feeding into the limbic system. This is the oldest part of the brain, just back here above the stem, and it's we share it with fish. We share it with every other animal, because we all need to have, fish need to have this sense of disgust so that they won't eat poison food. And your moral reactions come from here, which is informed particularly by disgust. Now that was the kind of history that Dudley wanted to teach. You know, do you find it disgusting? Okay, we won't study Daniel O'Connell anymore. What Dudley was teaching from was this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which we're learning to understand a lot more now that brain scans are coming in just in the last 5 years. Sorry, just have to pause here. So, I think what was happening was that historians who were trying to get students to look at the facts of the situation and to analyse the situation in the lives of O'Connell and Parnell, they could be trumped really by someone in the school saying, no, these men were cowards. And Dudley, that's not really what you go to do to spend 3 years at university doing. That's a knee-jerk reaction. It's not something that requires analysis. I just say again, this is me really, rather than Dudley. If you're deciding about whether someone else is courageous or not, if you're a judge of courage, that would suggest that probably you're quite a brave person yourself. But I don't really know how many people, especially if you were maybe a Christian brother, if you'd actually been out there, you know, in the field of battle, would you actually have any idea what it was to be a brave person to have courage or not to have it. So it's a very strange way to decide on other people. In fact, even if you have got courage, it'd be very difficult to look at. You wouldn't be able to look round and work out who's got it or not. Just even if you spent 5 years talking to them, you probably wouldn't know how they were going to respond. But these issues were the issues that partly damned O'Connell, and to some degree Parnell, even though they were very brave men. Because I'm going to give you an example, again possibly controversial for some people here, about one person who does suggest that Parnell wasn't as courageous as he should be. And that is someone who became very famous in Ireland and around the world afterwards. And Dudley was the external examiner on his PhD thesis, and the PhD thesis was looking at Parnell. And this is Conor Cruise O'Brien. And I hope there's not too many members of his family here, because I might have to leave hurriedly when I've given my talk, if so. Conor Cruise O'Brien, I think, became quite an authority on Parnell afterwards, and his book is still read. But he came out with a sentence, which I'm just trying to find here, which Dudley really objected to, and in Dudley's 7-page report, external examiner's report, he highlights this sentence. He's talking about 1881, and he's saying that if Parnell had chosen a different direction, well, Home Rule could have won. If we'd all had the insights of Conor Cruise O'Brien, if Parnell had gone this route, then it would have happened. And the sentence was, if Parnell had been the man who nationalist tradition now depicts, he and his followers would have seceded from Parliament in 1881. And the implication is that Home Rule would have followed very quickly afterwards. Well, Dudley's hair stood on end anyway, but it really would have stood on end when he was reading that. And he says in his report, without discussing whether this last statement is a permissible one in work of historical research, is hardly based upon a sufficiency of established facts. So I could really see Dudley in the room as I read this, and it got me partly irritated at a lack of the establishment of facts, because that's based on something that Davitt said. And Dudley, one of the themes in Dudley's half book is that that Davitt was quite an unreliable witness. He says here, Davitt's ability to diagnose policy or gauge character was severely restricted by his sensitive and suspicious nature, as well as by his impulsiveness and self-interest. But Dudley admired Davitt, but Dudley would criticise people and praise them. He could write paragraphs about people, giving the two sides, and those were weaknesses of Davitt that Conor Cruise O'Brien had relied upon very glibly. Dudley was thinking, and unfortunately, in a way, the Conor Cruise O'Brien story really took off, and he ended up. It was made into an RTE documentary, and he ended up winning a Jacobs Prize for it. But just we were talking earlier on about Charles Stewart Parnell and his ability to communicate, and what was it that made him so fascinating? Well, for me, having read Dudley's 50,000 words, I think Charles Stewart Parnell must be the most interesting person who's ever existed. I mean, both in literature, he's more fascinating than Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. There's almost a bit of that character in him. But it seems that I can't think of anyone who was more interesting than he was in real life either. And Dudley catches some of that. I mean, he says, talking about Parnell arriving in Parliament, he says, within a few, we're overlapping, but we can agree on this bit. Within a few short months, he stood revealed as the equal of the most outstanding and mature parliamentarians in the country, and an uneasy feeling was extending itself that this man could exercise an undefinable power of intimidation over friend and foe alike. And then Dudley talking about Parnell and Tralee in 1879, he says, it is doubtful if his audience has really minded what Parnell said. It was the way he said it, and in particular the tone of defiance he could employ in a brief, apt phrase which had such spellbinding effect. And I was going to cut this in case I ran on a little bit longer, but there's just another sort of quite interesting piece, Dudley's understanding of Parnell. And this is an area where in which, in fact, Dudley was a bit like Parnell, because Dudley was actually, believe it or not, Dudley was quite a shy person. So, writing about Parnell, he says, anyone concluding from his shyness, so he's talking about the young Parnell, anyone concluding from his shyness that he was also likely to be timid would have made a most grievous error. The surviving domestic memories unite in testifying to his aggressiveness, his determination to win in all his quarrels, his resourcefulness in achieving victory. Now that's an interesting distinction there, someone being shy but not being timid. I haven't seen that distinction made very often, and it's very interesting that Dudley should make it. As I say, he was someone who was like that too. At the start of his career, I just want to mention something about violence and anti-violence in both of these two great statesmen, partly because they were both, their reputations fell because they were seen as being anti-violence in some ways. I mean, we could also talk too about the extent to which they were anti-violence, and we could talk for a week about Parnell sitting on both sides of the fence there. But let's, because I've just got a couple of minutes, I'll just quickly run through some of this. Both O'Connell and Charles Parnell had their personal experiences of violence, so they knew what it was to be terrified. They knew what it. They knew. When I was asking earlier, when I was saying if you're a judge of courage, surely you need to have had been through that yourself. You probably will have experienced. If you really understand courage, you'll have experienced the feeling that you're going to die, and you probably accepted that. And I think both of them in their worlds, they have had quite a lot of experience of physical threats being made against them. On anti-violence, it's well known, or becoming better known now, about Daniel O'Connell and his stance on slavery. But what's made, and the human rights that come out of that, the human rights consequences of deciding that all people are equal and that we shouldn't use physical violence to take advantage of other people or to put them in their place. What's maybe less well known is about Charles Stewart Parnell and human rights, specifically through the issue of flogging, because he was the person in the British Parliament who, more than anyone else, saw through the 1881 end of flogging in the British Army and Navy. He had 150 MPs from different sides of Parliament coming to join him on this vote, and Dudley talks about this starting to happen because part of the young MP Parliament joined the Mutiny Committee, Dudley talks of his participation there as the beginning of an extended and determined attack on the practice of flogging soldiers for misbehaviour. Because Parnell knew that people were becoming soldiers or sailors, not necessarily because they liked the idea of living on the high seas, but because some of them, many of them Irish, were very poor, and that was a way actually of being able to carry on to escape some of the poverty and even to carry on living. After 1881, when flogging was banned then in the British Army and Navy, Parnell still had to police this. It was a bit like O'Connell after Catholic emancipation coming in. That isn't the end of the story. The two of them had to carry on seeing when it was being breached and pushing MPs and ministers to make sure that it actually happened, and often getting the answer back, oh, everything was fine. So in 1884, Parnell heard that flogging was being used by the British Army under the Egyptian military code, and he lays into Hartington, the minister in charge, who said, oh no, it's all perfectly fine, you know, this is Britain, this is the British Empire, but everything's being observed here. Whereas Parnell knew, could give example after example after example from Ireland, that what was supposed to be happening, because the law said it, was not happening. So he carried on with that. Oddly enough, I mean, I don't know how much is known about Parnell and flogging, and but lo and behold, I open up History Ireland this month, and there's actually an article in there about the Home Rule League, and its stance on flogging. So maybe it's coming back to be discussed. But it really does show Parnell's interest in human rights. Of course, I'd just like to give you a comment that Dudley made about Home Rule not being achieved. Quite interesting context on this too, because this was early 1960. The book, F.S.L. Ryan's book on the fall of Parnell has already been referred to, and Dudley is reviewing it, and at the time he also refers to what was happening in Congo and Nigeria at the same time, and he says, Dudley writes, when all is said, we may conclude that it was just as well that the lost leader, Parnell, failed to bring his people into the promised land, for what would have been the state of Ireland if Home Rule had been conceded only to result in a civil war in which the unpreparedness of the people for self-government could have brought disaster after disaster. We live in a world where the United Nations organisation has so far been sufficiently effective to control the successive disruption in the Congo. We forget that in all probability Irish nationalist training in political education was equally inadequate in 1886. We should remember that Nigeria in 1960 has had a degree of systematic education comparable with what our country only achieved some 30 years after Parnell's death. Even so, we did not escape the horrors of civil war. Perhaps Nigeria is not yet out of the wood. And here I'm giving you another example of Dudley being able to say, well, this is what could happen. 7 years later, we have the Nigerian Civil War starting, otherwise known as Africa's World War, because it was the greatest loss of life since the Second World War. 4% of the population died in Nigeria. And of course, like I don't mean to be indelicate, but maybe Conor Cruise O'Brien on the Congo, he learned more about what.
Excuse me. Sorry, the band was set up. When are they set up? You go ahead.
So I'm distracted onto the band away from my sharp comments.
The band are too early.
I think the band might be related to Conor Cruise O'Brien actually, because I was about to say something a bit mean there. That maybe Conor Cruise O'Brien maybe learned a lesson or two himself at this stage in the Congo about practical politics, and I think after Dudley had said that young men shouldn't really write biographies until they become older men, and maybe Conor Cruise O'Brien might have come to agree with that himself once he'd actually seen what it was like to be engaged in the front row, as it were. So what relevance do Daniel O'Connell and Charles Stewart Parnell have today? Well, they were the pioneers of today's world order, human rights, democracy and anti-violence. And it's this same world order that's now falling apart, clearly. Democracy and anti-violence are no longer the starting points in many countries around the world. Fascism is back in fashion. And the limbic part of our brains in many electorates is actually so much enjoying the punishment of people who are different to us, that it's prepared to accept that maybe that punishment is going to come to themselves a bit further down the road. As I'm talking about, Trump people who were voting for Trump who then find themselves ejected from the country or losing their jobs and wondering if really they should have voted for Trump so that he could sort the country out, because he sorted them out as well. I was just my experience. I was back in Canterbury, which is where I used to live. I lived there for here's the band.
No, good. Keep going.
Yeah.
Keep
So
going.
I was back in Canterbury, which is a really beautiful part of England. It's got 3 universities. It was the only part of the southeast that voted against Brexit. They're having fascist marches down this high street of Canterbury now in the last couple of weeks. I moved. It was time for me to come back to my roots, but I moved away post Brexit because I thought things are going to get really bad. I didn't expect them to get quite as bad as they have done. The United Nations, in a sense, I think. Sorry, just a different point to Canterbury, but. Talking about the relevance of O'Connell and Parnell to this world, which is the world order falling over, the one that we're used to, and goodness knows what sort of world order is going to come around instead. The United Nations is part of that sort of collapsing of the institutions that we thought held some kind of civilization in place. And the United Nations hasn't done very much. Well, to help sort out Gaza. We wait to see what's happening on that. The United Nations hasn't stopped Israel, the United States building up its resources, aircraft carriers and so on, positioning itself for what looks like a launch with Israel, an attack on Iran. Some people think that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, but quite likely by the end of the year. This is not in a straight line at all from O'Connell and Parnell. But there are, I think Ireland is a very good place to be. Ireland's been ahead on condemning Gaza, and it paid for it because there was this US and Israeli propaganda against us. Do you remember talking about investments here by American companies and Israeli companies, and then this word going out that Ireland was anti-Semitic, because that label will just get thrown at you. So I think maybe I can't really finish what I was hoping to say on this. I was going to finish with some quotes.
Go ahead.
Yeah?
Go ahead. You've got time. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, we have a historian Taoiseach who's committed money for 5 years, as you probably know, to celebrate Daniel O'Connell and his heritage, and that's going to go into schools. So maybe the chemist, his younger brother, who will actually know when a relative of mine goes in and asks in 5 years' time, who are your heroes? Maybe the answer might come back Daniel O'Connell. Maybe at some stage it'll be Parnell. Well done, or Martin. Whatever side you're on, that was brilliant to do that. And Ireland, we do have some underlying advantages. We're the 4th most educated country in the world in terms of 18-year-olds going to university. And we know about storytelling and narrative. I do think literally it's in our blood. And we therefore also know about propaganda, of which we're seeing an awful lot around the world at the moment. We know a lot about mass communications. We also have that in our blood. Thank you, Parnell. Thank you, Daniel O'Connell. And espionage, our armed services are taking that on board much more, and intelligence work. Lieutenant Colonel Rossa Mulcahy gave an interview to the Irish Times in August, and he said, we know espionage is a threat, so the intelligence world is going to be increased, the strength of it now in this country, and that underpins democracy as well. It's going to be very difficult, and it's going to be a very difficult time for us. We know that the US has been hoping for regime change in the EU and in the UK, and in fact, when it gets round to it, we actually know that the United States would like to see regime change here. that's why Conor McGregor was invited to the Oval Office. What other reason would there be? And we have a lot to deal with too in terms of dealing with Russia and the submarines, the Russian submarines that are looking at our cables, our communication cables. And almost in the last few days, I wouldn't say that America has become fascist, but if you look at democracy to autocracy and the spectrum there, clearly each day that's going by now we're moving in the wrong direction on that. And what does Ireland do when its neighbours are going that way? And also, yes, fascist marches in Canterbury. What will we do if we're stuck in the middle between them? I just ask you that question. I don't know what the answers are, but maybe courage. That's one of the things we need. And I'll conclude with just a few quotes, just from Dudley, what he said about both of them. Daniel O'Connell, 1947, saved Derrynane. Dudley standing there saying, Daniel O'Connell had taught them a lesson that by continuing to agitate they could get somewhere, that the leaders of the other side could see no light, that the Irish should be proud of their place in the history of the world. His lesson survived the famine. When he died, he left behind him something more sacred than his memory. It is therefore fitting on this centenary of Daniel O'Connell that the Irish people should, in this association together, secure for all time an eternal monument to his memory. And then I'll just say to you just a few words on what Dudley said about Parnell. Daniel O'Connell was Dudley's favourite historical figure, and I think probably Charles Stewart Parnell was probably almost there as well. And there's a couple of quotes from Parnell. The first one is, he says, the spirit of Parnell is rising triumphantly to guide us. The Irish military forces in the Congo have shown that iron discipline which the men of the Land League observed in 1880, as the chief taught them the superiority of moral resistance over violence and intimidation. And it's interesting, this is a section from what Dudley was writing there that could have been written last week, because it refers to what I was saying a minute ago about Ireland being in the middle of the United States and the United Kingdom. And Dudley says, political indiscipline could again destroy some promising Irish achievement. The lesson of Parnell can hardly be otherwise than one of urgency, an urgency in political education, and also an education in moral discipline. If we have nearly forgotten Parnell's warning against accepting Britons as our standard, we should remember that we have recovered our prestige because we are not the lesser allies of the British and the Americans, and that our own political future depends upon more attention to education and more insistence upon the higher standards in public life. And I'm just going to conclude. I mean, here we are at the Parnell Society. Thank you so much for everything that you do to protect this part of our great heritage, and I hope that that you can do a lot more than that with this in educating people in the future, and that we in Ireland can do more than that. And I'm just going to repeat that part of Dudley's quote just there. He was using words here that Dudley didn't normally use at all, like eternal or the spirit, but he said, the last bit I want to read to you, just the spirit of Parnell is rising triumphantly to guide us.
Well, thank you, Dennis, for that. That was magnificent, and begs what I admired most about the presentation was how you made history relevant. And it seems to me that the big challenge we have when the humanities are under sort of pressure from STEM and other things is to make subjects like history relevant. Studying history under Dudley and others in UCD, I had no doubt about the relevance of it. I think the sense of relevance is less strong today than it was decades ago when I was an undergraduate. But I think the sense of relevance was something which
permeating your paper today. Thank you for that. So, to the floor. Questions, comments?
Taking this, that was absolutely incredible. And on the relevance issue, what you brought up there about appealing to the neural pathways, this one or that one. I'm thinking about that in relation to Parnell's address, the one for the Dublin, where he was doing what I'm doing now, stammering. I'm just thinking where I can't remember where he was in his own family. Like what and what age he was at that stage, in terms of this was a kind of a new departure for him. He was stepping out of his comfort zone, And I'm wondering, have you anything to say in relation to that?
Yes, I do actually. I looked up about Parnell. He lost his father when he was 13 years old and 1 month. And he obviously didn't expect to take this career, but he went into it later. And another person there are some similarities to, who didn't expect the career that he ended up with, was John F. Kennedy, who was the second son. And it was only when his brother was killed during the Second World War that this shy, also shy academic person felt that he had to take on the family mantle and go into politics. And Jackie was upset for him because he was destined for a career writing, and he had won a Pulitzer Prize for some of his writing. In fact, I think about heroism and poetry, and a shy person, believe it or not. I mean, no one would have thought that John F. Kennedy was going to become a great speaker. But I think maybe some of these people who've had these devastating starts in life, Parnell losing his father at age 13, and obviously he was a boy's boy. I mean, playing around with engineering and that too. He always stayed a kind of an engineer throughout his life. He had these great, maybe no one expected an engineer to be good with words, but once he started to do it, maybe he was one of these people who could do it. Sorry, that requires it's a bit weird, but I certainly think that the bad starts in life, especially the stammerer, actually the stammer is a sign that something so difficult has happened to you that you struggle to get words out. Once you decide it was worthwhile to get over that, really, listening to the question there, I expected almost Dudley could have put more in, and he spent a lot of time researching Parnell in the States, but it really seems that he was fascinated by Parnell's personality, and there are so many variables in the story, certainly even on the American side, and him dealing with Devoy and going to give the different speeches and the different people who are trying to push him this way and that way. But Dudley says, suggests that one of his great strengths was the fact that he didn't say very much. He really didn't give his cards away, and he was brilliant at saying things, the great politician's technique that all politicians have to have, of saying something but leaving some room for manoeuvre. He was very good at that. And Dudley actually was brilliant at working out how he was able to put different factions together. When I looked at the variables, I'm qualified as an accountant, as well, so I'm quite interested in some of the sort of statistical side of this. There's something like, I don't know, there was over 20 different variables, all these different influences in on Parnell, and even for Dudley to write about them was complicated. But you'd need a mathematical mind, a bit like Parnell's mind obviously was an engineering kind of mind in the best possible way, and a mathematical mind, just to be able to keep these different people on his side. And lots of them didn't even like him, but they said, I suppose someone here from Healy actually saying, lots of people didn't like him, but they knew that he was the one who had the absolute understanding of the situation that they were in. So Dudley was, wherever Dudley was going to, wherever Parnell was, whether in America, in England, or whether he was here, it's the same fascinating personality that Dudley is trying to understand. He says, this is in 1879, he says, Parnell may have had no plan but to secure national confidence in himself and thus force government to let him rule Ireland. So Dudley's even sort of thinking there that maybe what was in the mind wasn't a big game plan, but that he could somehow rely on his own sense of judgment to get him through, as he obviously did in Dudley's book.
Yeah, I've just got a question in my mind. You're saying that something, and Parnell when he took over the estate here, it was in debt. So his entrepreneurial skills came out. There was in 1882 the harbour in Wicklow, Parnell Quarries in Wicklow. So if Parnell had never went into politics, how do you think, because his research and his estate that we know, how do you think as a businessman he would have went?
Yeah, I don't know enough about that. He said that he clearly had these great skills. I mean, sometimes the great innovator, though, can be so taken with the idea that it's the person who comes second that makes it more of a commercial success. I mean, some of these people who are very commercially successful haven't been great innovators themselves. I don't know if that would be the case. I suppose I think that when you have a great talent there, that if it doesn't come out, if he's speaking and his charisma hadn't been able to express it, if that might have frustrated him as a human being, because it was very surprising that he found himself in the but it's possible what you say, that he could have been someone he took seriously. He was way ahead of his time, looking at searching for gold, even if it didn't work out. Quite often you search for gold and you find something else instead, and create something different.
The quarries that he said in Arkham of Roadstone has been through the gold mine, and is continually like the digger, the further the deep down, the bluer and harder the stone. Like the entire Rosslare rail network is going to be protected because of the quarry in Arklow, because Parnell set that up, and then the roads, the rail network, the employment he gave, and that was while he simultaneously was an MP. Like there's an awful lot of energy there.
And the minerals, I mean, is it a range of minerals that they're finding?
No, there's a blue stone in Arklow that is so hard wearing that it is priceless. It is exported to wherever you need like marine armor, rock armor, it is of that standard. And yet further they go down, the more seams they find. And that is something that Parnell set up.
Any further
There
questions?
was just something you referred to, a character that I read a biography, I've kind of forgotten about, doesn't get much mention, Dan Bryan.
Oh yeah.
And I suppose you could call him Ireland's answer to George Smiley during the Second World War, but he was an extraordinary character, and he probably hasn't really got the recognition he should. There was a chap from Kildare who wrote a biography fellow whose name I can't remember, which is very good, but just when you mention his name randomly, people forgot him, but he's a very, and a very good, he would be a fellow you could do with having it around now, actually, at the moment, with the way things are, so.
Absolutely. I've got the UCD catalogue of his, because he left his archives to UCD, which Dudley set up UCD archives called that friendship. So in the end, the archives were left there. Because I was thinking the same thing. He was so gifted on the intelligence side, and Ireland really needs it, because if you're a small country next to a major power, well, you're a stepping off point for the Nazis or for. At some stages America are going to be interested. America likes these nice bits of real estate.
If there are no further questions, I think we better let the band set up now. So, in closing, can I just express the hope that you, Neasa, or somebody else will try and publish Dudley's 50,000 words, did you say, on Parnell? I actually I had intended to bring it along this morning, and in my rush out I forgot to bring it. I actually have a copy of Dudley's book on Daniel O'Connell, inscribed to me personally, which is one of is a lovely thing to have. But it would be great to have his thoughts on maybe that's a project we can take. In the meantime, let us express our appreciation. There's now lunch.
Swearing at the end.
I graduated in 1966. Was a young lady called
I love that point. Dudley never mentioned 'He's my uncle, so he's Yes. And Owen and I like over here. Is over there, so she's pro-Brexit, pro-Trump. She's pro-Brexit, pro-Trump. Yeah. She writes for the Belfast newsletter. Yeah. So, yes.
What's this book about?
Well, it's about Dudley and I suppose the ideas, how the ideas about teaching history changed, and how I suppose there's lots of themes I was mentioning. History is Don't worry about it. I brought one copy. I think it's long with me. I'll get it ready.
try that next time.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Well, that's, yeah, thanks. I suppose I will. I'll go.
All right, this is
Enjoy that, will you? Enjoy that.
It was very good. There's always something new to say about these people, isn't there? It's incredible.
There's like 5 different avenues have been opened up now. Where
Yeah.
you get to between the 2 dogs.
It's extraordinary people.
And yes, there are people in this world who are
Sorry?
yeah, Queenston.
Well, they had lots of meetings because Dudley was very keen that history would be north-south. That it was. Sorry, I just turned this off.